Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications, and I want to welcome one of our newest members, Bloom Pediatrics. They're located in Birmingham. So welcome to Beth Ellis and the rest of her team at Bloom Pediatrics. And of course, we're saying welcome to them on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. I encourage you to visit consumerscu.org to learn more. So we have a full show today, and we're going to kick it off with a couple of guests. SBAM recently launched a new service for our members to help aid in the recovery of the Employee Retention Tax Credit. We're actually working with two partners, both of whom are joining us today.
Great. So what I'd like to do in first to start out with a why, as SBAM brings partners to the table and resources to the table. It's we do this especially in areas where there's vetting needed in order to make sure that you're getting a great partner. And if you haven't yet looked into it, the Employee Retention Tax Credit has gone through some stages of evolution since the depths of the pandemic when it first came out. And the way that it was launched in the beginning and the way that it changed, a lot of companies out there don't realize that it could be really, really big for them. But at the same time, we've heard about some bad actors in the Employee Retention Tax Credit business that maybe have given some businesses pause in terms of checking it out. And so what SBAM has done is we're bringing to the table now very well vetted, well-established, professional, effective partners that can be used by small business owners to explore the potential qualification for the Employee Retention Tax Credit. ERTC is the acronym that you may see out there. So we've got David from Occams and Andy from CLRA are the two organizations. And why don't we start with I'll start with David just to introduce yourself, but also remind us what the Employee Retention Tax Credit is.
Hi, Brian. Thank you to you and Sarah and SBAM for having us on. The Employee Retention Tax Credit is a very misunderstood credit, and it is actually probably the single most generous tax credit that the government or the IRS has put out into the market in the last 20 or 30 years. It was designed very specifically like PPP to reward small businesses for keeping people employed when it was not easy to do so. So if you think back to the onset of the pandemic in March, April, May of 2020, the world was coming to an end. Unemployment had spiked to levels that we hadn't seen in the country since the Great Depression. And what Congress was trying to do was to help businesses keep people employed when it was not easy to do so.
So let's switch over to Andy now from CLRA and Andy, could you give our audience just a sense for what the main criteria are? So somebody's looking at it and say, yeah, I've heard a lot about it. I don't really know if I qualify. Is it worth my time? Our members are quite busy. They got a lot of things competing for their attention. What are the sorts of things that are the main drivers of qualifying for the ERTC?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, this tends to be a very misconception idea of, does a business qualify or not qualify? There are three criteria that allow a business to qualify for ERC. The first is if they had a 50% reduction in revenue in 2020 compared to 2019, and that would be quarter over quarter. The second criteria is if they had a 20% reduction in revenue in 2021 compared to 2019. Now, most people are only going to focus on those two categories. That's also known as the significant decline in revenue. But if you remember, I said that there are three categories. So the third category is business disruption as a result of COVID. So there are a lot of businesses today that are being told that they don't qualify because maybe they were considered essential, they retained their employees, or they grew during the pandemic, but they still had disruptions in business. Could be supply chain issues, maybe they had in-person meetings to virtual meetings, capacity restrictions. So that's where that third category is critical in getting qualified as well.
Right. And so when you talked about those comparisons of the sales too, which is a pretty objective measure, is it possible to you said quarter over quarter. So maybe you grew in a couple of quarters in a year, but you shrank in a couple of other quarters. Walk us a little bit through that.
Yeah, great question. So what will happen is that you would look at the 2020 quarter one and compare it to 2019 quarter one, and then same thing for each quarter. And you would also do that with 2021 compared to 2019. So there are 6 quarters to qualify, and you might just be able to qualify for 1 of the 6 or 6 out of the 6. So it's not an all or nothing. It's, kind of an or situation, but that's how you would qualify regarding the significant decline in revenue test. Now, what's also great is because of that category 3, business disruption as a result of COVID, you may not be able to qualify for the significant decline in revenue test, but you could still qualify in that quarter for the category 3. And that's a really big deal, as a lot of businesses are currently being told that they don't qualify because they grew during the pandemic, but they can qualify because of that category 3.
Got it. All right. Excellent. So David, maybe could you cover other just misconceptions, some things that are they're out there that might be barriers or concerns in somebody moving forward or deciding, yeah, it's worth my time to really check it out?
Absolutely, Brian. So I think Andy sort of alluded to this. A lot of people have taken PPP and that PPP was forgiven, and therefore they automatically assume that they don't qualify, or their accountant has told them that they don't qualify, which is not true. When the CARES Act of March of 2020 first came out, that was the case. You had to choose PPP or ERC. You could not do both. That was subsequently amended in one of the other acts. You absolutely can. You cannot claim those PPP dollars that the government gave you and you paid wages with to claim a credit back from the government. And essentially, that's double dipping. The other thing is that we see, and I'm sure Andy sees this a lot too, is the CPA says you don't qualify. And with no disrespect to any CPA out there, what happens is they tend to focus on the SDGR test, the significant decline, because it's an exact science. You apply the rules that Andy said, you look for the 20% reduction or you look for the 50% reduction, and it's an absolute fact. With the FPSO, the full or partial suspension orders, it's a little harder because you have to tie an authorized government mandate to an impact on that business. So it is more subjective by default, and you have to prove that in that specific quarter, you were impacted by that mandate. Now, it's worth noting that the language that the IRS uses is a more than nominal impact on your business. And what that really means is a more than 10% impact on a part of your business that represents more than 10% of your revenue. So they did set the threshold very, very low, but you still have to tie it to an impact from a government agency or mandate.
Excellent. And you'll see in the comment section, we did put in the link so that you can make connections. Check this out, and we'd love to have you explore it. Please do not miss this. It is one of the bigger opportunities that if you qualify, you can find it quite significant. So I'll stick with David, and then I'm gonna go to Andy right after that. I'd like for both of you, if you could maybe just give an example. Sometimes it's one thing to talk about these things, but maybe give a tangible example of a successful application that you've helped usher through the process. David.
Absolutely. So Brian, I'll focus on the FPSO, the full or partial suspension orders, because the SDGR is an exact science. There's a number of things that would qualify you there. If you had to close your office down and Andy mentioned supply chain disruptions, capacity restrictions, in-person meetings changing, commerce disruptions, all those kind of things. So a really good example that we saw was a restaurant in Daytona Beach. What happened is, first of all, they had to close down. There was a mandate that you had to stay in place. So that was the first issue that they had. The second issue that they had is some of the supplies that they got could not come into Long Beach. So they get specific alcohol from certain places, and they get a certain type of fish that represented a very big piece of their business that they could not get through Long Beach or Port of LA. So that was a direct impact because Governor Newsom had closed down the ports in that time frame. They had issues with, when they could reopen, and 50%, capacity restaurants went from 25 to 50%. That also impacted their business more than nominally. And then Another big impact that we had were a lot of the events that drive their business were canceled. For example, in Daytona, you have the Daytona 500, you have Bike Week, you have a whole bunch of massive events that were actually canceled. And then more than that, some of the states that feed into that Biker Week, I'm talking Ohio, Michigan, places like that, had stay in place orders. So although they were not Florida orders, it still directly impacted that business in Daytona Beach.
Understood. Wow, lots of different ways. Andy, how about why don't we'll make this the final word. Give us an example of something that might inform some of our members to be inspired to check this out.
Thanks, Brian. And yeah, this is usually my favorite time to talk about ERC because there's a lot of hearsay, but the results really matter. And so just recently, we helped a 20-employee construction company. They actually grew during the pandemic. They kept their employees. They were deemed essential, so they stayed open. And they were told by 2 different ERC vendors and CPAs that they wouldn't qualify because they did not satisfy that significant decline in revenue test. And we were able to get them over $450,000 in ERC because of that category 3. And, they had issues with supply chains in terms of getting the supplies, increase of cargo and shipping costs. Another example was that they would normally send 4 people in a truck to a job site, but because of the 6-foot rule, they had to take 2 trucks, sometimes even 4, to make sure that they satisfied the 6-foot rule. So these are some of the examples that we love to actually show them what they do qualify for, especially when they're being told no, that they don't qualify.
All right, very compelling case, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Again, these are 2 organizations that have been through a very significant vetting process with SBAM. We do not recommend that you do business with people unless we have checked them out very, very thoroughly. So please move forward with confidence, even if you've been told that you don't qualify. Does it cost you anything to check out and see if maybe you do? Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a very full agenda of items to talk about here, Sarah. It's been quite a busy summer so far.
It really has. And let's start off with a story that we talked about last week in depth, which is the UPS strike. Is this now settled?
Yeah, so we do have a settlement. We're pretty relieved about this. The last thing we needed was another supply chain problem when a lot of the supply chain issues have healed over time, and it's a 5-year contract. So the fact that they handle about 25% of the parcels, about 6% of the U.S. GDP is handled by UPS. The fact that this was settled before the time of a strike and closure is a really big deal, big weight off the concerns and minds of people that need to get stuff in to do their work and need to send stuff out to complete their sales. So it's about as much as we could hope for in terms of didn't go right to the brink, didn't go to the 11th hour. They didn't make us sweat it out. Whether it be a strike tomorrow, that sort of thing. It got settled, so we're good for another 5 years at least with respect to UPS.
All right, let's talk about a story or a news report that came out on Friday, and that's when the Supreme Court overturned the open and obvious standard. So can you tell us a little bit more about what this is and how our members might potentially be impacted?
It's kind of a big deal. So there's a precedent in the Michigan Supreme Court that has stood for decades, which was overturned on Friday. And it basically is a defense that you have against being sued, that if there is a risk, but that risk is open and obvious, then there's a high standard that you really can't, somebody's not going to be successful in suing you for it. There are a couple of cases though that went to the Supreme Court that challenged this assumption. And so one of those examples was that somebody was at a gas station. It was literally snowing outside. Snow's coming down, snow's accumulated on the ground, and they slipped. It's an open and obvious hazard. And but there weren't that would in the past that would have been a defense that would have gotten something thrown out. In fact, that case was thrown out. but it was appealed through the process, and the Supreme Court changed they essentially repealed that standard. Now, what does that actually mean? We don't know yet, because all that means is that cases don't get thrown out as easy. It doesn't mean that it's easy to win a lawsuit, but if there are a lot of more of these types of cases, or traditional like slip and fall type cases, Michigan used to have strong precedent that made slip and fall, the frivolous type of slip and fall cases, not worth anybody's time. This change potentially means that slip and fall accidents will be worth, or slip and fall lawsuits will be worth people's time. So it's a big change, and how big a change and whether or not it floods the system, I guess we'll have to see. But the dissenting opinion of the Supreme Court was definitely suggested and raises some concern that this could be a significant change in the liability landscape that Michigan businesses face.
All right, so moving on, the governor did sign the repeal of the no stricter than federal law. Can you remind us what that is and the impacts there?
Yeah, this was there's a law that's been in place for several years in Michigan, and it says that state agencies cannot apply rules or regulations, administratively derived regulations that address or that create standards that are more strict than federal, unless there is clear and convincing evidence that it needs to be stricter than the federal standard. So it's kind of talked about as though it prohibits that the law that was just repealed. It didn't prohibit stricter standards, but it limited when you could have stricter standards to just when there is clear and convincing evidence that is requires high standard. That got repealed. And so what it means is that without clear and convincing evidence, that state agencies can now adopt rules that are stricter than federal regulations. And how far will they go with that? Again, an open question, but it's been in the environmental area of environmental law where this has traditionally been the battleground. And so I think that's probably where you're going to see in Michigan's Eagle Department, where there'll be, presumably they wouldn't have pushed for this law to be repealed unless they had some ideas of areas where they wanted to have regulations that are more strict than the federal. So sit tight on that. We'll watch it closely because the law getting repealed is one thing. What does that mean in practice? I guess we're about to find out.
And in some not so surprising news, we did see another interest rate increase last week as well.
Yeah, so the Federal Reserve increased interest rates another 1/4 point, and by doing that, it took it to a 22-year high. And so what that says is that they're still frustrated with the level of inflation that we're seeing, and even though it is definitely lower than before, year over year, inflation has come down. The headline inflation has come down pretty impressively, but a lot of that are commodities, and that core inflation, when you take commodities out, particularly food and fuel, the core inflation is still over 5. And that's why you see the Federal Reserve still being aggressive. They've also become less concerned about recession. So when you put those things together, they increased interest rates. What was interesting to me about this is that they did not forecast what they intend to do next. They have been pre-scripting, saying, yeah, you should expect more rate increases in the future, or we're going to take a pause for a little while and see how this settles. They didn't say either of those things this time. They increased interest rates and set an expectation in the future that they're watching. There's lots of things that they're watching. So they see headline inflation coming down more quickly than core inflation. That's one factor. They see still the labor market is tight. They see that unemployment is staying low. In fact, many states have reached all-time lows. So these different factors are playing into this decision where normally you'd expect them maybe to pause here for a while when you hit a 22-year high. They did not give that assurance that they intend to pause rates where they're at now, but they didn't say they plan to raise them either. So, so I think that really they're sincerely are just waiting for additional data. They're going to watch that data and make a decision at the next meeting. And by the time we get there, I think it will be based on the reports that come out, based on the economic data, we'll know more about what to expect from them.
And so any predictions then on the recession?
Yeah, so they've been predicting a recession for a while. Now, the thing about economists, they predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. I mean, this is something that they tend to do, is they will predict more recessions that actually come true. They have stopped predicting a recession. So the Federal Reserve is no longer expecting a recession, just slower growth. Now, that doesn't mean a recession won't happen. It just means that their expectations have changed. The expectations changing to say that they no longer expect a recession, rather slower growth, I think is the reason they feel comfortable continuing to increase interest rates and being more aggressive on inflation. It means that as of right now, they're more concerned about inflation than they are about a recession.
All right, we're going to switch gears to the to energy. DTE recently announced its integrated resource plan. Can you tell us what this plan is, what it means, and kind of why we care?
Every so often, utility companies have to provide to the Public Service Commission an integrated resource plan, an IRP, where they get their energy from, basically, and how are they going to make sure that it's affordable and sustainable and meets all the standards long into the future. And so in this case, SBAM actually weighed in. We were an intervener in the case. We made our opinions known. Our interests are affordable and reliable. These are our 2 things. So as they go to decarbonize the sources of electricity, that's fine, but it needs to be affordable and reliable. And so as they were moving forward, DTE was planning on closing down. The big kind of headline out of it was the last coal plant they were planning on taking offline by 2035. They have agreed to do it at least 3 years earlier, by 2032. Where we had weighed in was there were some interveners that were saying they don't want the Public Service Commission to approve converting that from coal to natural gas. They want to see it just shut down and go to like more wind and solar energy. Our concerns around that really are about the reliability, how much base power, and according to their DTE's integrated resource plan, base energy, they still needed that base energy, the stuff that's always there. The thing we like about the natural gas option is that those can be turned on and off very, very quickly. So you can rely more on wind and energy as long as you have the ability to turn on natural gas really quickly if the sun's not producing enough, the solar panels aren't producing enough electricity for what's needed at the time, or the wind isn't blowing enough. To have that base reliable energy is important. It's an important part of the, at least as today, with storage technology that exists, you still need natural gas as an important part of the reliability equation. So that's how it turned out. So the final settlement and the approval is an IRP, an integrated resource plan, that includes shutting down the coal plant, but converting it to natural gas, which has a much smaller, very, very small carbon footprint, but also is reliable, can be turned on and off very quickly.
All right, moving on to another Supreme Court decision. This one related to no-fault insurance. What was the ruling there?
This one just came out this morning, so it's kind of hot off the presses. And there's been a lot of, for no-fault auto insurance reform in 2019, a lot changed in terms of having coverage options. Unlimited lifetime medical is no longer required, although most people are still choosing it as an option. But also the reimbursement rates paid to providers has been at odds. That 2019 law said that it's getting changed, that whatever you charged in 2019 and earlier has to be reduced by 45%. Reduced by 45%. So no more than 55% of what you were charging before, trying to get at people that were overcharging the system, but they charged that cut was across the board. Providers of medical services, particularly long-term care, went back to court and said, yeah, that's what the law says, but it shouldn't apply to anybody who was getting the benefit before 2019. The Supreme Court agreed. They agreed with a Court of Appeals decision that said that the mandated provider cut is post 2019. Anybody who is receiving the services before is entitled to the services as they exist when they bought the insurance before. So pretty big change to how things were initially implemented. What I'm not sure about, and we'll have to watch closely, is there's a fund, a catastrophic claims fund, that when you pay that portion of your auto insurance bill, it goes into this fund. The governor and the insurance industry and the insurance department did a big refund out of that fund because the benefit overall reduction in the benefit costs. Now, if the majority of people receiving the benefit, those who are on from 2019 and earlier, the serious auto accidents, are they going to have to do an assessment to replace what they refunded out of that fund? I don't know the answer to that question. It's an actuarial question, but it's one that it will be quite urgent to answer at this point. And as soon as we have an answer, we'll get it on the briefing here.
All right, and one last quick story about a missed deal that really may not actually be a missed opportunity for Michigan.
Yes, I'm actually gonna look just to make sure that I get the numbers exactly right, because it was difficult for me to wrap my brain around the generosity of a deal to get a semiconductor plant in Michigan. And this deal ended up going to New York, because amazingly, they bid a higher amount of tax incentives and subsidies and things to get the deal. So it's a company called Micron, and it was a 9,000 job deal. But what Michigan had proposed in their bid in incentives, it was a long-term incentives spread over 20 years, but it was 27.9, not million, billion, 27.9 billion dollars for 9,000 jobs. So if you do the math, that's $3.1 million per job. That blows my mind that the incentives game has gotten this big, especially when you consider that half of the economic activity in Michigan is from small businesses. And it's more diverse, it's more resilient, it's spread across every community in our state. And I know the big incentive deal is, is a game they got to play, but like it's, I must say that good for New York that they got it, good for Michigan that we didn't, because that level of incentive for a single deal, that many eggs in one basket, especially when you consider that our unemployment is like at a 20-year low right now. The idea of that means that it's all added costs. In the back in the Great Recession, we did incentive deals to land in Michigan They were taking people that were unemployed and making them employed. These incentives are that's not what's going to happen. It's taking people that are already employed from other jobs and moving them to this job. So it's taking a very diverse landscape and then concentrating it into a fewer number of places. So sometimes I know it's a real competitive world and it stinks to lose deals. That's a deal we're probably pretty lucky to lose.
All right, before we say goodbye, I want to let you know we do have a webinar scheduled for this Wednesday on the employee retention credit. So please, after listening to David and Andy today, if you have questions, want to learn more, join our webinar on Wednesday. And we'll also be in Kalamazoo Wednesday for our owner-to-owner event. So you can learn more about both of these upcoming events at sbam.org/events. Have a great week. We will be back here Monday.
Thanks, everybody. See you real soon.